Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome back to Other Minds and Hands. Hang on a second.
JK.
Got funny things happening here. Okay, there we go. Sorry.
Round
Welcome
two.
back, everybody, to Other Minds and Hands. I'm joined again, as always, by Maggie Parke. This is episode number 42 of Other Minds and Hands. Today, so we had originally planned
Wait,
to have...
I know. You just went straight over 42. It's the answer to the universe. Right?
I know, right? Like it seems kind of a big deal. Agreed. Yeah. No, it's
Love it.
so this is actually, it introduces a dilemma, right? Because of course, on the one hand, episode 42 seems like a really good place to talk about adaptations of Douglas Adams, but it's also May the 4th today, as it happens. So we had originally planned to have a completely different conversation to continue our discussion of Tolkien adaptation and look at there's a really fun conversation we would like to have about depiction of dwarves in particularly, building on what we were talking about Gimli before, and thinking about then how the dwarves were depicted in the Hobbit films, which of course focused very largely on the dwarves, and then thinking about the dwarves in the Rings of Power as well. So that's coming. We're still going to do that conversation because it'd be really interesting. But then we were like, oh man, it's May the 4th. Like, we should totally talk about Star Wars. So I think between Douglas Adams and Star Wars, we're going for Star Wars today because it's May the 4th. So we're gonna do that.
I know a lot more about Star Wars than I do about Douglas Adams. So.
Yeah, it is. Though Douglas Adams is a really interesting, the way in which, like, the relationship between the book, the radio drama, and the film versions is really interesting. But anyway, but that is not, in fact, our topic for today. Our topic for today is going to be Star Wars stuff. And Star Wars, I think, it's a really, we've raised this several times. Like, this has come up on a bunch of previous conversations. Today is a day I really want to kind of sit down and think. I want to think a lot about what it means, like how even the concept of adaptation applies to Star Wars, right? Because it's one of the things that makes Star Wars so different. I mean, you've got if you've got like the Lord of the Rings franchise and the Star Wars franchise, right? These are two major franchises, and going to be, moving forward, when we project forward, clearly there's going to be, a group of, 5 to 10 like major properties that they have plans for lots more future adaptations for. These are two of the big ones, right? Two of the biggest of the big ones. And so thinking about them together is interesting. But there's always, with Star Wars and Lord of the Rings, thinking about those two things, there's the big fundamental difference of source text, right?
Source text, yeah.
And so it raises the question, to what extent is something like Andor or The Mandalorian or any of the new stuff that's being produced, to what extent is that even adaptation? And how does that, like, when you're talking about adapting Star Wars, how does that even enter in exactly? What is the source precisely?
I think that's where we start to get a little bit muddy on some of the terms too, because adaptation, I mean, strictly speaking, it's one source text into another medium.
Right.
Like, then you have remediation, then you have retelling, then you have, there's all sorts of kind of other ways that you can tell stories in a different way without having a core text. So I guess we're talking about retellings or some other kind of story within the world. So that is the key difference that I think is really fascinating with Star Wars, that we don't have this core text that is like a Bible. It's not a sacred text that we are disrupting by changing something. But what we do have is an agreed upon canon. And that canon is muddier, but that is still...
Yeah, I was going to say, agreed upon might be ambitious in some respects, but yes.
I said, I was like, maybe not agreed upon. The goal agreed upon canon. or something like that. So like if you do something totally out of ilk, it would be recognized and people, would see that that's not canon, fine. But the encouragement of the creators of Star Wars to now branch themselves out, and we were talking about Star Wars Visions, which is the one that just dropped season 2 today. So there's 9 new episodes, and each episode is within the world. They're 9 to 13 minutes long, something like that, or 10 to 20 minutes long. So they're short, but they're within the world, and they tell like a new story of the Star Wars universe. And each episode is made by a different studio. So there's a different style for each one, and a different focus for each one, but they all exist well within the world. You could see how it would work. And that, I think, like we were talking about, music and dissonance and harmony, and it's just getting the music to play in harmony with stories.
It really, I mean, it's very interesting. So, I mean, clearly, I think clearly there is no question. Think about the categories of adaptation that I was trying to articulate before: the retelling, fill in the blanks, and the modulation adaptation, right? Clearly there's no question of a retelling, exactly, unless they did a full reboot of the Star Wars films, or like the original 3 films or something. Not just the later on. I mean, you could say that the later intrusions into the later cut, the later edit that was produced, was but that's not really a retelling. That's I mean, I would not call that I'm not evaluating that in the same way. Right. It's really modifying the original, or like it's really a second edition rather than an adaptation. So in general, because of the nature of Star Wars stuff, there can't be a retelling adaptation in the classic mode, but there are lots of fill in the blanks adaptations. And so this really begins to challenge, to really kind of push the frontiers and to push definitions of what does it mean? Like when you say that something does or does not fit. And of course, this is straight into the sights of all of the discourse about the Rings of Power, right? When people are analyzing the Rings of Power and say, or not analyzing, unfortunately, reacting to more often, when people are reacting to the Rings of Power and saying that doesn't feel like Tolkien or that does feel like Tolkien, what does that mean? In what sense? Like what vocabulary do we have to even talk about that? So the Visions project is a really fascinating one to me, because that those little shorts that are designed, and these are there are 2 different elements, right? On the one hand, these are short little independent stories, so there's no real connection to, so there's no plot cohesion that we're talking about at all, right? So that's one thing that's right out. Whereas like with the Rings of Power, it's not the same story, but there have to be plot connections, right? They're going to be, like if they were to kill off Elrond, that would have to be explained, right? Right. So I mean, to cite an obvious huge example, right? So okay, so there's no question of does the story fit into the larger narrative, right? That has been built around Star Wars. It therefore the Star Wars Visions project points exactly to all of those much harder to define elements of fill in the blanks, and that the harmonies and resonances, and does it work, does it fit, does it harmonize with the world, and
sorry,
go ahead. No, go ahead.
I really hope we get some sort of a documentary about it as well. Season 1 was all Japanese studios, and season 2 is 9 different nations, so each episode is from a different country as well as a different studio within that country. And the identity attached to that, I feel like that's really interesting. I would love to hear them talk about their process behind it. But like the whole concept of it, it just feels like they're leaning really heavy into that like fan fiction creative exercise thing. Like it's like a prompt in class, right? Like we're giving 10 minutes, come up with something. But the difference with this was that they had the executives of the Star Wars team feed into it. So like there was a lot of back and forth. I don't know what that looked like, but they just said that they were involved in guiding the stories and things. So I assume they did that to make sure it fit within the world, and the music was harmonious. But what a cool concept.
It is a really cool concept. And the thing that that's exactly what is so fascinating about the Star Wars Visions project, is that it's not just that you are, it's not, this is way more than just a regular fill in the blanks situation, right? This is not just a, like The Mandalorian was, or Andor was, or, you know, or you know, the Ahsoka Tano series that's coming, or the Obi-Wan series. This is not just, we're gonna fill out the narrative with other stories that, you know, can be placed chronologically in the scope of the larger story, the larger established story. But it's not just that, right? These are deliberately coming from different perspectives. They want them to be different. Do a Star Wars story in the style of your anime studio, right? Or in the style of your, you know, whatever it is. And so that they're deliberately seeking, as you say, different voices, right? To be speaking in here. So it's, on the one hand, it's supposed to harmonize, but it's also like not supposed to harmonize.
But it's also
right?
totally separate. Yeah, it doesn't play in requirement wise to the story, but it does play in tonally.
Yes.
So I don't know how we do that with our orchestra metaphor, but yeah.
Well, that's the challenge. So I mean, so to me, one of the things that's fascinating about this from like an analysis point of view is that when you're altering one variable, like if there are two, I know this is a massive oversimplification, right? But if we imagine two variables, one being sort of the Star Wars world and the other being the style and approach of the individual studios, right? The style and sort of ethos of the individual studios. If you, sometimes consistency, like if you have the same studio that's producing, let's just go to concrete examples. If you have, this is one of the things that I think we saw happening with the Star Wars prequels, with the episodes 1 through 3 when they came out. They were being done by George Lucas, right? So there was a consistency in like the source where it was coming from, and in some ways, therefore, in the style, right? But the question is like, does this story work? Is this a good story? Does this story work? Does it fit? And you think of some of the deep objections that people had to the prequels, and I totally understand the way in which that narrative has changed in the last 10 years, right? That you can't just say that prequels are horrible anymore and everyone will agree with you right away. I know that, and I acknowledge that. But you think about, so to cite a specific example, midichlorians, right? Or midichlorians. I don't even know if it's an E or an I at the beginning, but anyway, whatever. Like the things that, you know, this quantification of the force being strong with someone, that there's something in like somebody's bloodstream that you can measure. Yeah. In order to determine like how much of the force they have or how they're connected with the force. This was a thing that lots of Star Wars fans objected to violently, right? And felt totally changed the spirit of Star Wars, right? So again, with those two things, like the sort of the style and approach to doing the storytelling, and like the world, right? Getting the world right? Making it fit with the world. Even where it was the same, like the studio wasn't exactly the same, of course. But anyway, even though George Lucas was still doing it, right? On the one hand, on the other hand, a lot of people felt like this didn't feel right. This didn't feel like the first three films felt. With the Visions thing, what you're doing is the exact opposite, right? Let's deliberately and purposefully vary the things on this side, right? The spirit and style and ethos of the whole approach to the storytelling and presentation, while having some kind of consistency. Like the question is, in what sense are these Star Wars stories? What does it mean to call these things Star Wars stories? What makes them Star Wars stories? If they're not, I mean, like, what is it just setting? Is there something in style? Is there something about the kind of story? What is it that makes it Star Wars? So I find Visions a fascinating, like, frontier to examine the question of Star Wars adaptation, because I think if we can understand better what makes Star Wars Vision stories Star Wars-y, like what was the other part of the prompt, Maggie, that you're saying, right? If the prompt is make a 10-minute video, right? But it has to be Star Wars-y, right? It should be in your style and in your voice and representing your culture, right?
What are the rules that are in place that you have to follow? Yeah.
Right. But there needs to be a through line of Star Warsiness, right,
Yes.
throughout the whole thing. What is that through line of Star Warsiness? And I think it's a fascinating opportunity.
And who are the people that get to define that? So, I mean, I assume it's the executives, but like, if they're involved, great. But what is the list that they have that requires it? Because it's not style. You know, we have animation with Clone Wars, we have live action, we have manner of different kinds of special effect in different variations of Star Wars stories. So is it just living in the world? Probably. I feel like it would have to just be the setting. You know, when I think about Lotro and stuff, and we talk about the rules of what was allowed in Lotro, and at one point the game designers put chocolate for sale in the shop, and the Tolkien estate was like, no, chocolate didn't exist in Middle Earth, so you have to take it out of the shop. You know, it's like things like that. Like who? Oh, okay. I guess we'll follow that.
Right.
But yeah, what is the hard and fast there? So.
Yep. Yeah, exactly. And even when you talk about the world, well, that's of course the fascinating thing, right? Is that like it's many worlds, like any kinds of worlds. So it's not even like it. Star Warsiness does not even have the kind of touchstone. Not only does it not have a source text of Tolkien, but even when you're going beyond the source text and doing fill in the blank stuff, right? There's still Middle Earth, right? There's still like some kind of anchor there. But Star Wars, you've got hundreds of planets in many possible permutations, right? And different cultures of wildly different kinds, and scope to invent more, right? So was it when you invent when you do an adventure which happens on a new planet that has never been part of a Star Wars story before, possibly with peoples or races that have never been part of a Star Wars story before, what makes it Star Warsy? Because it's not, by definition, it's not world. It's a new world, right? I
mean, it has to have certain things that you recognize, right? Like we need to see X-Wing fighters. We need to see pod racing. We need to see, blue milk now. I don't know. Is that a thing? Like just certain things you expect to like tick off your list. Like we were talking about the one episode from Visions we both watched is this mother-daughter race, and the car they're racing against with the two hoity-toity ladies in it, the little laser that comes out is a tiny Death Star. I'm like, come on, that's great.
That was adorable. Yeah, I loved that.
Moments you're like, tick. So those are nice little leans, right? Like,
yeah,
nice little nods. But do you need those in order for the story to be Star Wars, or are those just nice little nods that are like Easter eggs? And I don't think there
were a bunch of other visual nods. So like, So the example, what was the title of that episode? I forget. It was in season 2, that was just released. But the thing that drew Maggie and I to both watch that right away, is that it was by the Aardman studio. It was by the studio that made Wallace and Gromit and Chicken Run.
That claymation.
Yeah. Yeah. And so it was done by them in their style. And I love Wallace and Gromit. I'm a huge. Wait, it's called what? I am your mother. I'm your mother. There you go. I am your mother. Glad we got the title because that's important. So I was really interested to see that, and because I will profess profound ignorance as to most of the studios and most of the styles that the other episodes were being done in. So I mean, I'm planning to go back and watch all to finish watching all the other ones. But many of the other ones that I've seen, I'm like, I don't know the source, in a sense. So we want to talk about this one because we both know. We're both familiar with the other work of that studio, and so can talk in a little bit more concrete ways about how the Aardman stuff is interfacing with the Star Wars stuff. And I think this might help to kind of point to the through line, right? How that stuff kind of works.
And also
Yeah,
explain a little bit more about the assignment.
right.
It's things just sit so differently that it's just such a neat case study to kind of look at, because there isn't this through line, but it does kind of lean into the assignment that they were given, that you can take Aardman, who we're all going to be picturing chicken and sheep and dogs and things like that, but turn it into Star Wars. That is
Yeah.
a creative exercise. So they weren't trying to get something that fit perfectly into their vision. They were trying to bring another vision into the world, which I just love. That spin it on its head.
Yeah. No, it was neat. And there were a lot of really fun, very Aardman touches, right? Things which were very Wallace and Gromit Chicken Run-esque about the story and about some of the characters, especially the mother character, who was very like Wallace in some ways. She's like a contraption inventor, just like Wallace is a contraption inventor in Wallace and Gromit.
Mm-hmm.
And her primary contraption invention is a little droid who looks very much like R2D2, but is instead a dog form. Like, so like the droid is sitting up and looks like R2D2. Like, and so the expectation is you're expecting it to then like go and wheel around like R2D2 is, but instead it opens up like an accordion and goes forward on all four legs like a dog, and is this sort of dog shape. But anyway, so there are all kinds of nods to like to so I felt like the mother and the droid were very much like the Wallace and Gromit kind of analogs in a sense, invoking those.
But then also these nice little nods to the Star Wars world that it's sitting in, like
Yeah.
the opening shot of the mom, she's welding something and she like moves away her welding helmet, and it's like the Boba Fett mask. It's a
Yes,
Mandalorian.
yes, it's a Mandalorian mask. Her welding mask is, which seemed almost within the story a self-conscious joke, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like the mom herself would have found it funny that she was using a Mandalorian, like had a fake Mandalorian mask. That was really good. And I love some of the other. So one of the plot of this story is the daughter, who is like a teenage daughter, or vaguely young woman, but growing up, and but the whole "my mother is embarrassing me" subplot made me think teenager as the father of teenagers. That she's trained to be a pilot. As a father of a teenager training to be a pilot who is often embarrassed by his parents, it resonated with me. But anyway, so one of the elements of this, and so the premise is that like at her flight academy, on that day is the day that they're doing this family race, so that like people from the academy can come bring their parents, and then the academy people, and it's a fun race, for the to be like a bonding thing for the families, and a community event for the school basically. And so the one of the things that and the premise of the story is that the daughter, who is sort of the protagonist of the episode, is embarrassed by her mom, and doesn't even tell her mom about the family race, despite the fact though that like they start off with memories of her and her mother. Her mother starts recollecting about how proud she is of her daughter, the pilot, and memories of how they used to play together when her daughter was little, and they used to pretend to be pilots, and she was the red leader and the daughter was red too, and they would and of course that setting is like within the world of Star Wars, right? We have this parent and child who are recalling the younger days when the child was little, they used to play Star Wars together, right? Which is a very kind of meta construction, right? I mean, like how many, human parents and children have, played the I'm ready, red leader, kind of game with their kids, right? And so that's part of the story inside this Star Wars world. And then of course they end up like, being in the race, and there's the really schmancy, posh nemesis girl and her stuck-up mom, who are playing dirty tricks to try to win the race and everything. But anyway, so the kind of meta element, the sort of like this short film is a kind of fan reaction Star Wars film, right? Which is itself like modeling fan reactions to Star Wars inside the film, right? But which also is itself participating in the Star Wars world. Like is trying to maintain that Star Wars through line through the whole thing, right?
Because when you just step back and look at it, like it has recognizable characters. We have seen those shapes and those insignia and those armor plates and those costume, those uniforms, like all that stuff we've seen before. So it all clocks visually that nothing jars. It fits. Basically what they're doing is a pod race. We've seen a lot of that. We're familiar with
right.
that kind of
right. So yeah, they do invoke the a familiar scenario. Right? Yeah.
We're talking about a family dynamic that's at the core of a lot of Star Wars stories that we've got,
emphasized by the title "I Am Your Mother," right?
Which is so nice with "I Am Your Father." I mean, when you parallel those, it's such a nice.
Both the sort of the effect of building it up, right? Like to putting it in parallel to the Darth Vader reveal, in The Empire Strikes Back, compared to, while at the same time it's also like it's nothing like there's no dramatic reveal. It's not that kind of story, in fact. But the invitation of the parallel, and the way it prompts you to think about, it just invoking that concept in the title. Right. Yeah. Overlays the entire mother-daughter relationship within the story with this really fascinating level, because I mean it invites this comparison about like, in what ways, so like the kind of deep and epic heroic struggles that Luke has with his father and his identity in the original trilogy is played out in small ways, right, within other, within all families in some ways. Like it's almost like taking the archetype that the Star Wars trilogy was invoking and sort of showing, and here's how one way in which this archetype works out in real life. When you, as a child, as a teenager, are establishing your own way and forming your own path and beginning to think about building your own career, but you still have these parents who are kind of embarrassing, and their social pressures that make you want to distance yourself from your parents. But anyway, all these, like, and those are like the real life ways in which those archetypes, work out, right?
Well, and like playing around with that title because it messes with our own expectations.
Yes.
Reason I picked that episode was because it was Aardman and that title. So it's like, that sounds cool. Because you're along the lines of "I Am Your Father." It doesn't have to be a review, but you're prepped for that kind of impact. And all of the turmoil that's packed into "I Am Your Father" and what leads up to that, and what the after means, and the importance of parentage and how that defines who you are. That's not what this is. This is, "I'm your mother." Like I kind of want to swear. "I'm your mother." Like I'm gonna do this, and we're gonna kick butt. Let's go. It's just such a different tone that it was really fun. And it was I thought really brought in beauty. I mean, for a short film, it was 13 minutes. I mean, it was very, very short. But I felt that they accomplished a lot in, the daughter's sense of her identity and her relationship with her mother, and how she was going to, how she was defining herself and kind of juggling the variables of the external expectations and pressures on her compared to within her own family, right? And the family, both the
separation from her mother, but also identification with her mother. And I mean, there's all of that stuff was played with. Really, really interesting. I mean, it was a fascinating development in that way. But again, the I am your mother reference serves as such a cool backdrop. Like it just, with that one title, it places the entire thing. It invokes this whole other context, which it's not explicitly connected to in any way. But yeah, so very, very, very cool. Very, very interesting. Other, trying to figure out the Star Warsiness of it, right? How do you put your finger on the Star Warsiness of it? It's hard because some of the things, there are a number of ways in which it goes out of its way to, again, I'm just focusing on that short, goes out of its way to maintain a kind of continuity, right? One instance, they're on comms at one point. The daughter is inside the pod and the mom is outside the pod with the dog robot, the dog droid, and they're talking to each other on comms. And the comms that they're using are the exact same comm unit that Luke was using to talk to 3PO from the trash compactor in the first film. You know, that little the little white cylindrical canister thing, right, that he's talking into there. They were using exactly those communicators to talk back and forth to each other, which was so on the one hand it establishes a kind of continuity, right? On the one hand, it simply gives you this yes, I'm in the same world defined very, very broadly, right? I'm in the same galaxy. I'm in the same kind of story. There's something Star Warsy about this because I recognize that item. The uniforms, the flight uniforms, yeah. Were like, so her school uniform, her academy uniform was like a TIE fighter uniform. Which, by the way, it was hard for me to tell. Did you get any sense of where chronologically this was? Like Empire, no. Republic, New Republic?
I mean, I assume it's not too far off Republic because things looked kind of the same. But I say that, and then I love the timelines that Star Wars did play with and how even the modern ones harken back to older tech. And so no, you can't really tell where this is.
I mean, my guess would be New Republic, mostly because her flight uniform was much more X-Wing fighter, Rebel X-Wing fighter look than, Empire TIE fighter pilot look, with the black and
I feel like you could probably go through everything in the background and pinpoint it, just based on the droids that we see and things like that. But that would be fun. And I imagine that's what they did. When we're talking about the detail of a microphone, right. I'm going to assume the studios that they tapped into are fans themselves of Star Wars because that's who you want to work with on something like this. So it really is, like somebody said it earlier, licensed fan fiction.
Well, all adaptation is licensed fan fiction. All adaptation is fan fiction. Like that's
this one is licensed and encouraged and nurtured. How's that?
Yes. Yeah. Yes, exactly. To do their own thing, but again, to have some kind of continuity. But so back to the comm canisters again. On the one hand, that establishes a kind of visual continuity, right? So it's one. But it does more than that. Like when I see somebody holding that up close to their mouth and talking into it with urgency, I don't just think, oh yes, I'm in the Star Wars world. I'm remembering the scene where Luke is talking into that 3PO, right? In the original, in A New Hope. So it feels like it references like that, and even the Mandalorian thing, right? So like that was one connection. The use of that comm felt like one connection where I felt like it was actually introducing that moment in A New Hope as a kind of subtext of that for that scene, such that I was kind of going back and forth in my head and being like, why am I being asked to remember that scene at this moment?
Yeah.
Like what is the point of contact I'm supposed to be making? Similarly, the Mandalorian mask that you mentioned, right?
Yep.
Because it's not just like she was welding, right? I mean, it looked like the mask. I mean, it was only on screen for like 3 seconds, so I didn't I didn't pause it and study it. But I think it looked like the mask of the boss Mandalorian woman, the Forge Master. Yes, exactly. So it was like Mandalorian Forge Master mask with the like flame and the welding, like, and the way that they introduced, like they didn't just show a woman welding, right? They show like the flame bursting out. It reminded me of the forging sequences.
Well, and they show her as a Mandalorian first, don't they?
Yes.
I mean, that's
yes.
what you see first, and then the mask moves away.
Yeah.
And especially coming out 2 weeks after the last episode of Mandalorian season 3 dropped.
Yes.
That's not
fresh in mind. Yeah, exactly. So
Mandalorian's worth like a quick little nod too, because when you're thinking about like how we can create within this world and the strength of Star Wars as a source, Mandalorian, yes, we have some books and some things that we know there was more of a world, but in terms of film examples, Boba Fett wasn't supposed to be anything, and people latched onto him as kind of a cult following, and it turned into this massive thing. So we then got a whole culture and near religion like culture, and ways that people behave and how they become part of this community and society, and the drama that unfolded with that turned into an entire multi-season series on itself from this one little character that was theoretically a throwaway originally. Yeah. So the ability to build in this world is awesome.
Yeah. Yeah.
I don't just be like, cool, dude. I mean, like, it inflicts awe in me to look at that and be like, oh my God, look what they did. Yeah.
No, I think it's really interesting. But yeah, so just looking at the ways that felt like, therefore, again, another cross-reference, like another one of those moments where this short was invoking this other thing. It was another subtext in that moment, another another piece of intertextuality, as we would say in the literature business, right? Where one text is both working from and with another text, but there's just these moments of confluence when you're using another text, but you're not just recycling it, right? You're interacting with it in interesting ways. And so you're both using that other text as a resource to inform your story and frame it in certain ways, like provide some expectations and give some context in some ways, but you're also commenting back on it as well. Anyway, yeah, the juxtaposition of the armorer from The Mandalorian with the mom figure in this little short is a fascinating juxtaposition, right? So anyway, these are things. I raise this because when we're trying to, one of the things we're pointing to and trying to find the sort of Star Warsy through line, right, of these kinds of things, is these specific references, right, where you can ground it in, like, okay, yeah, so they're out there, their pilot costumes look like X-Wing fighter costumes from the rebel, from the rebellion, the comms, right, the mask. These are all specific callbacks, but in one sense, they're way too specific callbacks merely to be like world building, just like establishing the thing. It's instead showing how this short film, and even as you say, the pod racing setup, right, the way in which that was also bringing us back to the sort of this the concept of young Anakin Skywalker competing as the kind of underdog, little kid Anakin Skywalker was in the Phantom Menace pod racing sequence. That too was evoked. All of these things help to establish a kind of continuity, but they do way more work than just simply saying like, oh yeah, this is recognizably Star Wars, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think it might have been recognizably Star Wars without it, but that's exactly what I'm trying to sort of figure to put my finger on more, because that I think is what will be the way in which these stories interact with each other, the way that they see themselves as part of an overall narrative, not just from a plot perspective, but like the way they interact with each other thematically. I think about the way in which Luke Skywalker was brought into season 1 and 2 of The Mandalorian. I haven't seen season 3 yet. But anyway, so the problem is I've been watching The Mandalorian with my whole family, like my wife and son and I have been watching it together, which means we only have the occasions upon which we all get together to do that. So it means it's taken. We've been watching Andor, and I haven't finished Andor yet because they've been traveling and whatever. Anyway, so I haven't watched Mandalorian season 3 yet. But anyway, back to the example with Luke Skywalker, right? The way that Luke Skywalker gets incorporated into that, the way that Ahsoka Tano got incorporated into, was that season 1, I think, of The Mandalorian. I think it was. I can't remember now. But anyway. Yeah. So the way that Ahsoka Tano and her story from the Clone Wars series gets then invoked also, in that it's not just about story continuity. It's not just about plot, right? It's about this sense of you are contributing to not just narrative, because it's not about plot. Right. It's not like there aren't plot holes that need to be filled. This, the I Am Your Mother short filled no holes and will bear no, there's no story in that now, like, but however, I could imagine in a future show like that daughter there being a pilot who is that race of creature, and who I learn more about that, or is in school. Right, exactly. I could actually see that being incorporated, but there's nothing like in the larger big narrative, right? In the way, for instance, that Rey's character in the 3 sequel films was designed to be like moving the big story of, the Empire and the Rebellion and the Jedi forward, right? There were no such aspirations to this little short film, or even to some of the shows, right? Mm-hmm. Necessarily. But
they also weren't gimmicky, which I feel like is a big difference. Like we grew up in 90s sitcoms and stuff, or at least I grew up with 90s sitcoms and stuff, where there were like crossover episodes, where like some of your favorite characters would appear on another show, and it would just be a gimmick. It'd just be funny to see those people in the world. And that's not what this is. This is like believable. They live in this world, and here's a little element of their story that we're going to give you alongside some additional information that feeds better into this element of the story. And it works.
So the way in which world building happens, though again, world building on a completely different sort of scale, because you can build any kind of world you want within the Star Wars universe. But how does it, if it's not plot and it's not like literally world, right? It's, what is it? Ethos? Is it just like the kind of character, the kind of story that gets told? Is it theme? I mean, to some extent, of course, there are some things to whether or not something feels like Star Wars, right? Again, to use that same phrase that has frustrated me so often with Tolkien stuff. What is it that makes something feel like Star Wars? Sometimes I think there are some elements generally of the Star Wars aesthetic that seems to me a big part of it. Like Star Wars stuff can't be too clean, right?
Like it needs to be industrial. Is that what you mean?
Well, no, like physically dirty, like actually dirty. Like things are like kind of run down. Like
Yeah.
it's if largely because of the military or quasi-military context that was given to Star Trek from the beginning, right? There's always been a kind of cleanness of uniforms, and it's not to say that there's nothing. I mean, it's one of the things that I really like about Deep Space Nine is that it's like a normal world within, that interacts significantly with the militaristic world of Starfleet, but is not just a crisp edged military production like you get on a Star Trek ship.
Yeah.
Star Wars has always been grungier
Gritty.
than that.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so is that part of it? Is that part of the ethos? Like, is that kind of element of the general aesthetic of Star Wars? The thing is, I mean, you talked about technology, right? Certain technological through lines. Would there be certain technological advances or technological things which would immediately rip us out of Star Wars context, right? Something like a transporter, for instance.
Yeah, I think the answer is yes. And it would be hard to define where that line is because there's a lot of things we haven't seen in the Star Wars world. So it is possible that it exists and we just haven't seen it yet because we haven't been to that world. But you have to be able to play enough into the expectation of the viewer that you're not messing with it.
Right.
So yeah, if like a giant purple dinosaur suddenly appeared, that'd be a little weird. Doesn't quite fit with what I picture. But
Right.
show me a world where it makes sense because you've led me with a few breadcrumbs that make sense within the Star Wars universe that when that purple dinosaur comes in, no, I don't know why I picked that, but then it makes sense.
Right. Yeah. No, that there are certain that there are parameters for the world, which if you deviate from these basic parameters, it's not going to feel like Star Wars. So yeah,
and that's where it becomes a game, right? Like,
yeah,
I want it to be like Star Wars. So here's the things that I'm going to have. The same way we were talking about myth last week. Like, if you're going to have an archetypal story that plays around with myth, then you're going to lean into the fatherless hero, the mentor type figure, the powerful object that helps them along their way, and
the monomyth is a monomyth for a reason.
Right. Yeah. Like all that stuff will be in there, which it is in Star Wars. You can see a lot of that. Well, that's a whole other lecture. And like, George Lucas went heavy into the monomyth, brought Joseph Campbell in to help make that happen. But you will have that checklist because it does have to fit pretty heavily into this core structure that they use to build the world. Yeah. And that's where, like, yes, I am going to have an X-Wing. Yes, I am going to reference the Mandalorian. Yes, I am going to have a Death Star. It's just going to be itty bitty. Yeah.
So let's do some brainstorming. Would love to hear from folks who are listening. What are things that you would identify as essentially Star Warsy things, like elements without which it wouldn't be Star Wars? I will say, pilots, like flying human, like creatures, sentient creatures, flying crafts, right? Like being pilots, like there's that's think again, just I brought up Star Trek because it's a common comparison, right? But think of the difference between, there are people in Star Trek who might be skilled at navigation or something like that, but there's nobody in Star Trek who is a pilot in the same way that that Han Solo is a pilot, right? And that's such an important element in so many things, right? Okay, so people being pilots, which means if you told a Star Wars story, a story that claimed to be a Star Wars story, and you had like all of the vehicles automatically operated by computers and droids, it wouldn't feel. I think that would be a thing that might,
be based entirely on land without space travel, and starships. Like, Yeah, I feel like that does need to be a part of
Yeah,
it.
at least with, it's not that you couldn't have a story that's sort of local in some way, and even if it were exclusively local, but it would have to be there would have to be some involvement there. Adrian, it's a perfectly fine place. Let's totally start with the obvious stuff: lightsabers and the Force. Yeah, now you can have stories that don't involve Jedi and lightsabers, right? Like that's possible, though there aren't all that many of them that don't
No,
involve it at all.
and you have to believe that they could pop up at any time and it would make sense.
Yeah, yeah, right, exactly. So uh, let's just say the Force more generally. Lightsabers in specific, they certainly are obviously extremely iconic for Star Wars. But again, I don't think they're essential in the sense that, again, if you had a story in which no lightsaber ever appeared, people would be like, well, that didn't feel like Star Wars to me, right? But but the existence of the Force,
Yep.
and that might not it might not be a major plot point, right? It may not be, but some kind of awareness of the Force. Right. Vondiel says Rogue One. Right. Yeah. Were there any lightsabers at all in Rogue One?
At the very end, Darth Vader's when
Right. Darth Vader comes in at the very end. Yeah.
what an
Yeah.
entrance. But the rest of it is almost like a secret. It's a hidden thing. You know, I'm one with the Force is within me. The chant that guy, he clearly has some Jedi training or awareness or something. It's enough for you to be like, it exists in the world. We're still there.
Right. Exactly. Yes. Yeah. Because the fact of the existence of the Force, the idea of balance, the ways in which the Force flows through everything and ties everything together. If you were to tell a story which in some way, and I can't off the top of my head think of a clear and concrete example of a story that would like completely violate that, or would be, but some kind of sense of that. I do think that that's sort of essential. Like you couldn't tell a story which would feel alien within the world of the Force.
Do you think the Visions episode we were just talking about talks about the Force?
It doesn't talk about it. I don't think it has to talk about it.
No, it just has to be.
Right. It's not a through line in the sense of every story has to be about it. But if it were, it's one of the things you can't be discordant with. You can't have a story that's discordant with the Force.
It needs to be able to exist there.
So, for instance, let me try to give a concrete example. One of the overarching principles of the Force in Star Wars, as far as I can see, is that giving free rein to negative emotion is bad, right? Seeking vengeance out of anger, that is the dark side of the Force, right? So if you do that, if you were depicting somebody, who, if you had like Shadows of Mordor in Star Wars world, it wouldn't work there either, is what I'm saying, is what I really want to say. That's the parallel that I want to make. The way in which the Shadows of Mordor video game deviated from the Tolkien ethos is very much the kind of thing that I'm pointing to here. If there were a Star Wars story, a story that claimed to be a Star Wars story, which is simply saying that indulging rage in order to wreak vengeance for a past suffering is unproblematically great, that would be discordant, I think, with the whole kind of ethos of the Force that has been built through all of the Star Wars stuff, and would feel weird. That would feel discordant, I think, in important ways. So I'm trying to come up with a counter example, like of what I mean, because it doesn't have to be explicitly about it. Somebody was asking, Nerdly Wisdom was asking about the Solo movie. Does that touch on the Force at all? I don't remember it being discussed, but again, think for a second about Han Solo's character in the original Star Wars films. He explicitly disowns all of this, mumbo jumbo, right? And yet he's also Mr. Never Tell Me the Odds, right?
Yeah.
His own reliance upon luck and fortune, and even fortune and glory, right, is not unattached to the Force and the flow of the Force through him. And of course, one of the dramas of his character development over the course of the 3 films is not his like conversion to a new religion or something, but his understanding and recognition that he was a part, like the Force was flowing through him all along, right? He's not a Jedi, right? But he begins to see that like actually this Force crap that the Jedis are always talking about, it's actually a thing, right? And it connects even with me and with what I do. So there's an element of that, as I say, I think fairly prominent element in Han Solo's character development throughout the first 3 Star Wars films. And some of that element, nerdly wisdom, is something that I still see them playing with in the Solo film, right? The his reliance upon luck and fortune and is still Forcey, right? Or again, at least it is consistent. Right. It works consistently in it's the demands that it makes on my own imaginative investment are easy to make when I come in with Star Wars parameters. Does that make any sense? Mm-hmm. So it can be really vague like this again. And it's not like the list that I'm talking about, the brainstorming that we're doing to think about these Star Warsy elements. They're not like a checklist. Like you have to have them all, or they have to be a part of the story.
And I think my list would be different than your list, but there would be a kind of core stuff that you would want to appear in the things to be familiar. Like, when you first said that question, I immediately went to visuals, and I would need to have boxes and boxy things and square things and hard edges, because there's very few sleek, like when we saw the ships of Naboo, I was like, what is this?
Yeah. I was just thinking that yes.
I love the like 1960s, 70s kind of architecture and design that they worked with. And even in the very modern ones, they kept the big old buttons, like the big old squares.
Yes. And the big levers and things that you're always, all
very mechanical. And even in Andor, we saw a lot of that. It's just a lot of big plastic junk pieces that work in space. Not sleek, svelte, aerodynamic.
Even the knob that Grogu is always taking off in the Mandalorian, right? This like big clunky threaded knob,
Things don't work, Things constantly shut down. You go into hyperspace and it goes, So having that kind of element of the big old piece of junk, that I feel like that has to be part of it. So that's probably like the gritty industrial that you're talking about.
Yeah. But yes, when you said the word sleek, the image that appeared in my mind was what's her name's ship from Naboo, Padme's ship from Naboo, like when they flew to Coruscant from Naboo, and I'm like that does not like. And notice, by the way, how they played on this to an almost extreme degree in the Aardman short, right? Yeah. The good guys, the mother and her daughter are in what is literally a box. Like they call it like a box of junk, like a laundry box. What was it?
It looks like a lunch box. Like it's not like a board cube. It looks like I forget they're called Cool Mate lunchbox,
right? And like literally laundry is falling out of it and stuff, right?
Super like and
right
down.
right Whereas the ship of the evil bad guys, right, was like sleek and svelte and beautiful, right? It's
like a Ferrari in comparison.
And you almost always there is an almost automatic distrust for that, even the way that so like the Star Destroyer, the Imperial Star Destroyers, are still kind of boxy.
Oh yeah.
Close up, right? But when you see them from a distance, they still they've got all these all this stuff, right?
Divots.
But they but from a, like when you see them from a distance, like in the opening shot of every movie, right? They still look well, they don't look exactly, they don't, not shiny, they don't like sleek shiny, but they're and you know, I wonder, do you think, I never thought about this sleekness thing. You're completely right about it, though. It really is resonating with me when you're saying that. Do you think that's part of the reason why our generation distrusted the prequels? Because they had the good guys flying some pretty sleek ships. Like, think about the ships that Anakin and Obi-Wan are flying in, like, the Revenge of the Sith, right? The ones that, you know, with like that go fit within the rings in order to go into hyperspace and everything, right?
They look like Flight of the Navigator stuff. They look way more Star Trek than they do Star Wars, and that's not bad. You know, the Enterprise has a very sleek hull, even though it has a lot of stuff within it. It's very sleek, and just nothing Star Wars is. I do like what were we just watching? I think it was Mandalorian. Oh, it was, you know, one of the more recent Star Wars ones on Disney, but you see that ship again. And that really clocked where I was like, oh, Naboo's here. So now there's a tie to it. I understand that ship exists in my world, but it didn't exist then. So it was really jarring. So I think there are a lot of things that fed into that trilogy being problematic, but that's probably one of them.
Yeah, no, I agree. That is really interesting. And again, what you were just saying is so fascinating, because it does help perhaps to explain your expectation, the boxiness, unslinkness. Like, the Millennium Falcon trained us, right, that like all of the best and most trustworthy ships are held together by duct tape. Like, if there's something that is like high end, and then it's evil, possibly actively evil, but at least probably not trustworthy, right?
Because a lot of money, but we don't trust money.
Exactly, we don't trust money. And that's exactly what Mrs. Manrique was just saying. Sleek denotes power and money. Exactly. But again, later on, once that sort of becomes accepted, now that like that sleek silver needle ship from Naboo is now just a Naboo thing, right? And now it just, you know, so you see it, like, you see a ship like that. I see a ship like that in the Clone Wars, and I'm immediately like, oh, they're from Naboo. Okay, like now it's just it's part of the world building. So if you enter into that, now I still think though that there is still something important in the Star Wars through line about the whole ships held together by duct tape thing, right? That does seem to be an important part of the ethos. It is fundamentally fundamentally an underdog story, right? It's about underdog stories, like the people in power. This is one of the things that is always, which the early films I think did not do successfully, but which things like the Clone Wars do much more successfully, which is explore the tension of when the good guys were in power in the Republic, when the Jedi Council is in power in the Republic before the rise of the Empire. There's this tension, right, between the good guys who have the money and resources and are in, you know, the good guys have the money and resources and are in charge, right, and the bad guys are like in some way the scrappy insurgents, right, trying. But it can't. If you just reversed it, it wouldn't work at all. Like, it would feel like that would feel totally alien. So they don't do it that way, right? Instead, they have the Republic being manipulated from within, so that the Empire was always in power, in a sense, right? There's a sense in which the Empire was always in power. It just wasn't officially the Empire yet. Right. But they have to explore that. And the Clone Wars at several points does, I think, a really interesting job of exploring that tension. Because there is a real, like, when the Republic and the Jedi are just throwing resources at stuff, right? It's uncomfortable. And there's a discomfort that I think is very profitably utilized in the storytelling, in the Clone Wars show in particular, that I thought was really interesting. And again, but it plays on this thing, right? And obviously the what were they called? First Order in the sequel films, right? One of my biggest problems one of the things that challenged my secondary belief in the sequel films most pushed me back on just actively suspending disbelief as hard as I could was how on earth is the First Order funded? Like, how is it that the First Order suddenly, as this like sort of rogue element in the first film, like, where do they get their funding? Like, why do they seem to be operating with all of the resources of the old empire when they're like a splinter group, right? And so, I mean, that was a huge problem for me. It's like, on the one hand, it worked in the sense of like, oh, so the good guys who are now theoretically in charge are the scrappy underdogs again. Like, this all feels like it works on one level, except with my brain. Like, my heart liked it, but my brain did not like it, because I couldn't handle it.
I feel like you just described the problem with all adaptation reactions. And that's the thing, like, when you're talking to like creators, that's the really difficult part to get across. Like, head and heart have to work together. So heart is expecting A, head needs to make sense of B, and you're going to throw R at me? Like, come on.
Right. Yeah, no, it is one. So, I mean, and this is, so, I mean, yeah, picking it back exactly on that. This is why I think it is right to think of every Star Wars production really since the first three films. The first three films I'm willing to sort of accept as a unit, as like a primary text in some sense. But I think that every other film, from the sequels, from the prequels to the sequels to all of the shows and everything else that has happened, it's all adaptation, right? There are ways in which it is all fill in the blanks. It is also modulation in some ways, but it's almost a different kind of adaptation. But I think I'm so glad we had this conversation, because it really helps me to think through.
Me too.
Because again, all of this is relevant to other adaptations as well.
And all of it's constantly telling me that there's a problem with the terminology of adaptation that we really must revisit and put a book together or something. Because this is definitely where you would start to talk about the definition of close adaptation, loose adaptation, things like that. But that doesn't work with this.
No, it doesn't work. Yeah. And even my three categories I think are failing me a little bit, because my three categories, all of them still assume there is a source text, right? And it's a question of how you're related to the source text. But what if when there isn't a source text? What if
and the world we're getting into, I mean, definitely Star Wars, but Marvel's doing the same thing. DC's doing the same thing.
Absolutely.
We know Harry Potter's thinking about going down that road. We know we're going to see some different reiterations of Tolkien in the near future. Like, this is a known thing. So, we're going to have to work on this.
Yeah, exactly. I think that my original three categories were almost unconsciously insisting too much on the source text. Well, I mean, they were the answer to the question I was asking, which was how are adaptations related to the source text? But what about when they're not? What about when there isn't a source text? Exactly. And the problem is the categories are not exclusive anymore. That is to say, this kind of adaptation, if we're talking about I don't know, like an ethos adaptation or whatever, however we would characterize this, when you're just trying to tell a story that fits within the ethos of this world, right? It is fill in the blanks in one sense. But it's, I mean, again, like the I Am Your Mother short by Aardman, there wasn't a blank that was, there wasn't like, oh, I've always wanted to know that story. Let's tell that story that's never been told. That's what a fill in the blank story does generally, right? That's what the Rings of Power is doing. That's what the War of the Rohirrim is going to be doing when that's released. But this is not. This is just, we're going to tell a story in that world. But it can be a world that you've never seen before.
But it kind of also scratches the itch of the gap you did want filled. You just didn't know it was a gap, but it's not a gap we know. You know what I mean? Like it fits in and is as satisfying as one of those gap stories.
Yeah.
But it's not a gap story.
Yeah, exactly. And it also, I would say one of the things that I think is so much fun about adaptation of a source text, like when you do have a source text, one of the things that I think is so much fun is the way in which that relationship between the adaptation and the source text invites really interesting inquiry and discovery of both, right? Both of them illuminate each other in really interesting ways. And this is the thing that I keep wanting to say to Tolkien fans, and I don't think I'm going to convince people. It doesn't matter if the adaptation is good or not. It still has this effect. A bad adaptation will illuminate things, sometimes just by contrast. I mean, like when you're watching a bad adaptation and saying they completely missed the boat on this thing, well, your understanding of and appreciation of that thing is likely to improve by contrast, by, as you're working through and saying, gosh, they really missed the boat on this. Why is that important? Why do I care about that so much? Why do I think that that's such an essential miss on their part? You are now thinking through the original text in ways that you weren't ever before. And even if they were things you did appreciate, you're now going to be appreciating them in new ways that you never saw before.
That is such a beautifully optimistic way to look at it. Really crappy.
But it's true. There were so many things in really bad adaptations. Yeah.
But I also feel like we should still validate you're allowed to be mad because it's a missed opportunity.
Yeah, like, you don't have to like it. Yeah, exactly.
That's the thing that we get kind of up in arms about. Like, people want to use words like massacre and
right,
and all these things that are really difficult. I feel that hard, Susan Cooper, Seeker. What the hell,
Right.
But right. The fact that and get some good out of it, I'm a big fan of.
even if you could probably sit down and come up with a list. It might be intemperately expressed, but you could probably come up with a list of here are the top 5 things that they missed about Susan Cooper in that adaptation, right? Easily. And that the way in which that bad adaptation is going to trigger you to point to those things may it introduce you to think those things through in ways that you would never have articulated before you had that. It
starts to really clarify this checklist, so if there is something that really makes you mad, it's like, oh, because that is important. And isn't that a handy thing for a creator to know ahead of this, So this is what I mean when it's like still shocking to me that they don't work more with people like us or people that are able to do some of the analysis ahead of the development, that you want to bring them in and say, here's the script. What do you think? Well, you're doing this thing. People are really going to balk because.
Right.
Tell me why.
Yeah. No, it would be, it is fun and will continue to be fun to do lots of this kind of analysis after the fact. Golly, wouldn't it be fun to be involved in more discussions before productions are being made? Like, could we have this discussion earlier on?
And think how much more money they would make if they just thought it through.
And this isn't to say, we are so much better at making movies than they are. If they had only consulted us, they would have done so much better. That's not it at all. It's just, this is a kind of thinking that often movie makers and TV make, they're not, this is not the ways that they tend to think often.
Because they just want to tell a good story. So they're just going to try to put together a good story. And that's questionable depending on who's in the room and audience and all that. But if you're putting together a good story that's different from the expectation, that's really always the battle, expectation versus what they actually see.
Mm-hmm.
I just wanted to give a nod. Nameless Arcanum talking online about Rings of Power has gotten me so much deeper into Tolkien. Same, Tolkien's always been something I loved, but really digging into Rings of Power and this adaptation process through it has given me so much more insight into Tolkien himself and the original works and, all the things that you guys know way more than I do. Yeah. It's been fantastic. So
it's been awesome. I mean, more than anything else, I think it's sort of I think back on my own reflection of my, my journey from just complaining about the Peter Jackson films originally, feeling how much my own in talking about the films, as has been inevitable, over the last 20 years, I've been well aware of how those conversations have enriched my understanding of Tolkien. It's not about like I saw the movies and all of a sudden Tolkien was open to me in ways that it's not like that, right? It's about the discussions, and which again is true of the Hobbit films as well. Like there are so many things that I see much more clearly about the Hobbit and the Hobbit's relationship to the Lord of the Rings than I did before the Hobbit films. And to that I owe all the discussion of the Hobbit films, the analysis that we did, the discussion and anticipation, the discussions that we've had since then. But yeah. Anyway.
I love that we thought we were just going to touch on Star Wars, and we're like, nah, we just scraped the surface. But yeah, there is so much more. And I know a couple folks were mentioning Andor. I think that's one of the best Star Wars things. Andor and Rogue One are like the best I've ever seen. And I use it classes all the time for examples. I would love to do a dig into that. I have to rewatch it though, and you need to finish it. So
I need to finish it. Yeah. And I will say, I finally did finish. I know I finally finished Clone Wars. I
haven't done Clone Wars.
Huge respect for Clone Wars.
Cool.
Really huge, especially as that went on. It was phenomenal. Like it was what I found most fascinating there. Because see, that's one where there almost was a source text, except its relationship with the source text is so interesting and complicated. The source text is Revenge of the Sith. And the project of doing a fill in the blanks adaptation, which is literally filling in the time in between Attack of the Clones and the Revenge of the Sith. So it's filling in the blanks,
right?
But the way in which it recontextualizes, it's like when the Clone Wars were started, you knew the Revenge of the Sith was a terrible movie. Like you knew it was not successful as a piece of storytelling, right? So how do you take that existing story and reinvent that story? It's like 7 seasons of television designed to transform a bad story into a good story, because it does all of this, the character building and stuff that now, like, by far the biggest, in my mind, reason Revenge of the Sith was a failure as a story is that I was not in any way compelled by the narrative of Anakin's fall, right? This was the whole, we all knew, right? That was the premise of the prequel series, is like, let's see the journey of Anakin Skywalker and answer the question, how does Anakin Skywalker come to be Darth Vader, right? That's obviously the fun. And that's where they failed ultimately for me, because the conversion moment of Anakin in the Revenge of the Sith is so unconvincing, where he just flips the switch and goes from I have these inclinations to I'm gonna go kill the younglings. I mean, it's I cannot follow along with him. Like it just does not land. But the Clone Wars, you get 7 seasons of Anakin's projection. I mean, each one is a little less than half an hour long, but we're looking at 60 hours maybe of narrative, right? That connects those two dots, the dots of where Anakin is in Attack of the Clones too, with the building of Anakin and Padme's relationship, the experience that he has during the course of the war, the way that they set up and prepared for Executive Order 66, and the turning of the clones. Oh man, like it is so powerful when it happens. And the final 4 episodes of the show are happening contemporaneously with the events of the Revenge of the Sith. But Anakin and Obi-Wan and Mace Windu, like none of the major characters that are in it are in the show at that point. It's the Ahsoka Tano, who is Anakin's Padawan, is the chief character in that arc, and we hear things happening, right? Like, you know, we're told that you know, like there's like the Jedi Council is going to go confront Palpatine, right? And we know that that's the scene when Anakin turns. And, you know, Obi-Wan is headed to, I forget the name of the planet that he's going to, begins with an O, to confront General Grievous. And I remember, like, that's when the clones turn. Like, it is then, so I knew that. And all of these clones that we've known that have been primary characters, they're like really good characters. And it's like, the heartbreak of knowing that these people that we have come to know and love over the course of the show are going to turn, right, and are now going to try to murder the Jedi. Oh man, it is it's really powerful. It's so fascinating. That whole exercise was really interesting.
I know we keep saying exercise, but that's just what it feels like. This is an incredible creative exercise, and
yes,
I like that the creators are now opening up to that. And like, you know, the whole purpose of doing Visions was to just expand international partnership. That's such a like corporate line.
Right.
How creative, you know?
Yeah.
Really cool.
Exactly. The kind of embracing of like the global community of Star Wars that Visions seems to represent, I think it's a really fun thing. And as you say, it is almost exactly like a kind of exercise, you know, given in school. Right. Here's your premise.
Yeah.
Do this.
And especially now age-wise, when you think about the people that are creators now are the ones that were absolutely inspired in the 70s by the originals, then yeah, you're having a whole lot of fan service pulled in by people who are now artistic professionals in their field, which is so fun to watch.
By the way, we're out of time now, but that's a topic I want to discuss. We've talked about there are several like commonly used phrases that you hear all the time in reaction and discourse, online discourse. A lot of today's discussion is about that, like, it doesn't feel like, or it does feel like, right? What does that mean? I want to talk about the phrase fan service. What does that mean? What are the boundaries of it? When is it good? When is it bad?
All right, let's put a pin in that. But I think that
we'll talk. Let's talk about that,
because it's kind of like a buzzword, but it does fill a gap that needed to be filled. So, like, I think it's a really useful term with a potentially very muddy definition still, because we're figuring out what that means. But
yeah,
a lot of people use it as a slur. You know, like, oh, it's just fan service.
It's just fan service.
Same way, oh, it's just fan fiction. Yep.
Exactly. It's all fan fiction.
I love it. Yeah.
So anyway, let's definitely come back. You know, we need at some point to start like actively compiling a glossary, you know, of like terms we've discussed, some terms we've developed, some terms we've just kind of scrutinized.
We had a volunteer at one point that was going to help us do that. We need to refocus on that and pull some of this together. Everybody gets a writer's credit.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah, let's do some kind of community thing. That would be fun. Anyway, all right. But meanwhile, gotta let folks go. It's getting late for Maggie and getting to be dinner time around here. So better run. Thanks everybody for joining us. Really fun Star Wars discussion. Obviously, we haven't finished Star Wars, but it was nice to we've kept sneaking Star Wars in as examples and illustrations of things, and it was good to just kind of sit down and look at it a little bit more systematically.
Cool.
And the Visions thing is really cool. I you know, folks who have access to that, I encourage you to look at that. It wasn't something that was on my radar because I've been focusing on filling my gaps. Like I finished Clone Wars, just started Rebels actually, so I'm watching Rebels now. So there are all these things, these gaps that I'm trying to fill, and so I overlooked Visions at first. It was really great to learn more about it. I'm going to go back and finish all that soon.
Same. I'm going to be falling through that rabbit hole this week, which I'm excited about. Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you guys. Bye now.
Bye.